Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat. I'm with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Pick it up next week. Welcome, everybody, to Momentary Zen. I'm your host, Zen Garcia, and I thank you for joining me this evening. I have as guest with me Josh Peck, who's also a radio host, broadcaster, and author, and has been on the cutting edge of talking about a lot of the esoteric subjects which are piquing the interest of a lot of people. And so we're going to be talking to him over the course of the next couple hours. And I want to also just let listening audience know that my computer, for whatever reason, is lagging a little bit this evening. And so I just wanted to make you aware. But Josh, are you there, brother?
Yes, I am. How are you doing?
I'm doing really good, and I thank you for taking the time to join us and for to coming on our Revolution Radio broadcast. Also, another thing, and I'm not sure if this is because of the lag, but my volume is adjusted weirdly, and so I'm having to listen very hard to hear you. But I want to make sure those of you that are in the chat room, if you would let us know as to the volume level and if you could hear Josh clearly. And then what I might do is on one of the breaks, just reload and then bring Josh back on to see if that fixes the volume and the way that it is right now. But Josh, I really again appreciate you taking the time to join us. If you would, please let people know about the books that you have written, as well as your website and where you do your broadcast, where people can go to support you in your endeavors.
Yeah, absolutely. My website is www.ministudyministry.com, and I'm going to put that in the chat thing here, so if people are in the chat, they'll have access to it.
All right.
Let me just do that real quick. And I have I have all my books up on there. My first one was called Disclosure, and but really I think what that book was kind of me figuring out how to not write a book. I made all the mistakes in writing that I could possibly make through that, but so it took a lot longer, but it turned out pretty good. And my real first book as a professional, I guess, would be Quantum Creation, and that's the one that kind of set the pace for what I do now. So, but yeah, people can get that on ministudyministry.com. I also host a show called The Sharpening. It's primarily on YouTube, but it can also be found on Podomatic as long as the bandwidth limit isn't reached. But I have links to that on my website as well. So again, that's ministudyministry.com.
Okay, wonderful. Well, if you would also just tell us a little bit about what brought you to Revelation as far as the New World Order, and what also led you to the study of biblical prophecy and your interest in the scriptures.
Sure. Well, I've always been interested in prophecy, and I was raised as a Baptist, so they, at least in the church that I was brought up in, they kind of touched on prophecy, but it was really just the more general stuff. It wasn't really anything too specific, but I was still interested in it. and in my teenage years, I kind of got away from the church for a while and went more New Age, I guess, and I really got interested in just all sorts of prophecy. But there was something about specifically scriptural or biblical prophecy that always seemed to resonate more with me, and I think it was mainly because of the overwhelming accuracy of it. It always blew me away. I mean, and if I'm being honest, and I think most Christians, would be honest about that, there are vague, prophecies in the Bible, sure, but there are also extremely specific ones, and things that couldn't be self-fulfilled, right down to the day kind of stuff. And I found even more of those that if you look into the original languages of Hebrew and Greek, you can even pull more of those out. So that really that helped get me kind of back into the Bible stuff, and that along with a lot of other things, but just in a nutshell. So I started studying on my own with my wife, and we found some other researchers that were researching similar areas of prophecy. I think the first one that we came across was L.A. Marzulli, and he was actually available. Like, he kept himself available to be able to talk, so I was able to get a hold of him and chat with him a little bit, because I of course had a lot of questions, and that and along with a lot of other things really put me in a place where I rededicated my life to Jesus. So that's kind of where that's kind of the lens that I look at all of this stuff from, as a biblical lens. But shortly after that, I got really interested in science, and that was another thing that I've always been interested in. But growing up in a church, a lot of times we're taught that science and religion don't mix. So it was almost like I had to pick one or the other. But I married my wife. She was really interested in science, and especially quantum physics. And so a lot of times for date night, we would just put on the Discovery Channel or something like that. And so I became fascinated with this stuff, and I realized the more that I was studying scripture, that there's actually quite a bit of quantum physics in there, and that really blew my mind. The more that I learned about quantum physics, and just from my own private study, and I'm not a scientist or a physicist or anything. It's just more of a hobby, or just an interest of mine. But the more that I looked into that, the more I was seeing a lot of parallels in the Bible. And so over the course of a year or so, I gathered a lot of research and decided to put it in a book, and that was what my book Quantum Creation was all about. One of the biggest things that I realized too is a lot of there were two main things that at first were tearing me away from science. One was that I thought that I couldn't have science and religion at the same time, but also I thought that you had to be a genius to understand that stuff. And I'm certainly no genius, so I had a problem. I was really interested in it, but after my wife got me into some of the stuff she was looking at, and I started to see it for myself, I realized really just a lot of it is based in terminology. They just use a lot of words that we don't normally use, so it's almost like learning a new language. And once you get the hang of that, the concepts behind things like quantum physics are actually pretty simple. So I wanted to write a book that could put those concepts in a way that anybody could understand, and also show how they can apply to spiritual belief. So that was Quantum Creation, just in a nutshell. I guess that's kind of what led me down that road.
Well, tell us about your other books as well, and
sure.
Yeah, and of a brief summary of each, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess I should backtrack a little bit, because I had a few books. I actually have 10 or 11 books. I won't go through each one individually, but the first one was Disclosure, and that one was the one where I really wanted to show how a lot of the things that were taught in church traditionally aren't actually biblically true. There were some things that I was brought up with that, you have to have your hair cut a certain length, or you can't wear jeans on Sunday, or just kind of ridiculous stuff like that. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there are deeper theological problems that I wanted to address in Disclosure. So I brought a lot of those together. And what really sparked my interest and really got me to get back in the Bible again was when I learned about Genesis 6, how the sons of God procreated with human women. And I'm sure your listeners are probably all too familiar with that. And that's what really started it for me. And I realized, I had never heard this in church. I must have read Genesis 6, 100 times, but it never really clicked that this is angels and humans mating here and creating this hybrid offspring, the Nephilim. So I wanted to take those sorts of fringe topics and put it in a way that somebody that was coming into it from a traditional background would be able to understand and accept. So that was Disclosure, and I had that out, and then after that, I started writing little miniature. I called them mini study books. They were like 50 pages, just on different topics. I had 5 of those, and one was on the 4 different kinds of baptism in the Bible. There was one about the Day of the Lord, what that really is. There was one on spiritual warfare and what the spiritual government is like. And then there were a couple others. One about the resurrection and ascensions of Christ, and then there was one other one about what loving God really means. So I had those 5, and that's where the name Mini Study Ministry came from, was from writing those books. So I put all those together. I still have them for sale, individually. They're like $5, and then I have them all in an anthology that has some extra stuff that I've written throughout the years. So I wrote all that, and then after that was when I wrote Quantum Creation, and then my most the book that I just put out a few months ago is Cherubim, Chariots, and that was the one where I wanted to take concepts of physics to show how reports of UFOs and things like that. There's 2 main hypotheses on what those are to people that believe that it's something outside of the Earth. People either usually subscribe to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which says that they're from another planet, and then there's the extra-dimensional hypothesis, which actually goes right in with spirituality and scripture and things. So I wanted to write a book trying to use physics, and especially quantum physics, to show how the extra-dimensional hypothesis, even though it's not as well known, it actually does make a lot more sense, and it's a lot easier to understand. I think a lot of the confusion really just comes from what dimensions actually are. So that's what Cherubim Chariots was all about. And then now I'm working on a book. This will be my first. Every book, that I've written so far has been self-published. This one that I'm working on now will be the first one that'll be traditionally published. It'll be published through Defender. I'm sure people are probably familiar with Tom Horn, but if not, you can go to skywatchtv.com and learn all you want. He's an excellent researcher and writer and lots of stuff, but he'll be publishing that. And this one's looking at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, and really what the discovery of the Higgs boson meant for the world, not only in terms of scientific progress, but really in terms of prophecy. And if biblical prophecy talks about any discoveries in quantum physics, there's a lot of theories that say the Large Hadron Collider is going to open a doorway, to the abyss, and so this book explores a lot of those things, but it also really gets down to the science of what they're doing, so people can, because it's really not that difficult. It's just, unfortunately, the people who are put in charge of explaining these things to the media, they've been they're usually physicists and scientists, so they speak their own language, and it doesn't always translate to people like us. So, I want to put together a book that really talks about the science behind it, but also what it has to do, with the Bible and prophecy. So that's what I'm working on now. Yeah, those are pretty much all my books.
Well, that's quite a bit of work. You've been very, very busy. I commend you on all of your endeavors, and those are all very intriguing topics. And likewise, myself, I was involved with the New Age for 20 years before being brought full circle back to the study of these scriptures, and it was actually the Genesis 6, the whole thing with the sons of God mating with the daughters of humanity that led me back into the study of Scripture, into as well as the extra biblical, extra canonical texts, and everything else that I could find that it had anything in connection to the regular canon, the pseudepigrapha, apocrypha, all those different things as well. So we are similar in our walk in that regard, but if you would, can you let's start off with what it is you think about CERN and what your research has made you believe is really going on? Because I know a lot of people speculate that the CERN device has something to do with opening stargates and the invitation of interdimensional beings into this era and this plane of existence, as described by the similar thing was done during the time of Atlantis with it's described in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth that they open similar kind of things. And so what has your research led you to believe about CERN and what the agenda, if there is some ulterior motive to all of that?
Yeah, and that's a really, really good question, and that was the question that I had that really that really prompted me to write a book like this, because and even still I see both sides, and now that I understand a little bit more of the science behind it, it does help answer some things, but I'm still a little weary about everything when I started writing the book, I whenever we look for information on CERN and what they're doing, we get one of two extremes. Either we get a totally scientific, where it's like, this is all fine, but here's just the hard science behind it, or we get like the fringiest of the fringe, where people are prophesying that CERN is gonna like blow up the world in a couple months, or and we'll get stuff like that. So I really wanted to try to find a common middle, and look at the science, but look at it in terms of the Bible and prophecy as well. And are the things that they're doing, is it okay with God or not okay with God? And to answer that, it really does take it takes a basic understanding of the actual science that of what they're doing, and it really goes all the way back to quantum field theory, which to me is one of the most interesting things. I wrote just a short paragraph pretty much about it in Quantum Creation, but this new book, it's going to be central, because what quantum field theory states is basically everything in existence, like every elementary particle, which is the smallest of the small when it comes to particles, where you can't divide it anymore. It's not made of anything, which that always confused me. But when you get to the smallest of the small of particles, let's say quarks or something, or electrons or photons, what they really are is they're a wave in a field. And what a field is you could think of it as every point in space has a value for any certain thing. One example could be the temperature in the room. Every point in space would have a temperature associated with it. The higher up you are, closer to the ceiling, the temperature, the values would increase, and the closer you are to the floor, it decrease. So it's just every point has. Now, temperature in itself isn't really a field, because that's just a quality of the air. But if you think about that with like forces, like the magnetic force or gravity, the gravitational field. What that basically is it's just a collection of values that tells you how strong the gravity is at every point in space. Or with magnetism, how strong the magnetic field is, at every point in space. So all throughout space, we have dozens of fields. I think at last count it was 57 or 58 fields, because every elementary particle has a field associated with it. So you can't have a field without a particle, and you can't have an elementary particle without a field. So that's how they know, for example, that even though they haven't observed or detected gravitons, they know that they exist because there's a gravitational field. So and that helps answer the question, like how the Large Hadron Collider basically smashes protons together. How do you get something like a Higgs boson out of that? Because the Higgs boson isn't hiding in the proton or anything, but so that helps answer that, because all a particle is a fluctuation in a field. So when the electromagnetic field fluctuates, that fluctuation is the photon. So I'm sure we probably all have heard the question, is light a particle or a wave? And most of us have never got the answer to that. The answer is it's a wave. It's just when we look at it, when we perceive it, when we observe it, it resolves into a particle. But reality in itself is actually waves. It's just our perception that says that it's particles, and that's what quantum mechanics is all about. So when they smash protons together in the Large Hadron Collider, what they're actually doing is they're releasing energy into other fields, because one point in space, again, can have dozens and dozens of fields. So when you smash two protons together, that's why you get a photon and an electron, or you get quarks that fly out of. You get basically a bunch of particles that fly out of this collision, because that energy has to go somewhere, and it goes into all the other fields that's occupying that space. And when those fields fluctuate enough, particles are created. That's what particles are. So that's what all the excitement was about when the Higgs boson was discovered. It wasn't so much the boson, but it was that because they detected the boson, that's proof of a Higgs field. And what the Higgs field does is that's what determines mass, not exactly the boson, not exactly the particle associated with it, but when a particle interacts with the Higgs field, that's what mass is. So that's what gives it its mass. The more it interacts with the Higgs field, the more mass a particle will have. Now there are particles like photons that are massless, which before quantum field theory, before I understood that never made sense to me. How can something exist and be massless? Well, when we realize that it's just all energy, that's all it really is, then it makes sense. And so like a photon, which again is just a wave in the electromagnetic field, or a fluctuation in the field, when a photon, the reason that it travels at the speed of light, not only because it is light, but because it has no mass, it doesn't interact at all with the Higgs field. So that really helps bring a lot of this together. Now, the interesting thing of how, like, what this has to do, with the Bible and all that stuff, they don't know all the particles that they're creating, because they're detectors. We don't. The world doesn't have detectors that are sensitive enough to detect gravitons, because gravitons are another thing that they're massless. They have no mass of their own, but it's not like a photon where we can actually see them. We can see the effects of gravity, but we can't, at least right now, we can't detect a graviton. But the interesting thing about gravitons is, and this isn't any like crazy pseudoscience thing. This is actual science. They can transcend dimensions. So whenever they smash these particles together, they're basically, if you look at it in this way, they're basically creating passageways to other dimensions. But again, the other end of that, the science end of that, says, well, nature's doing that all the time anyway, so it really shouldn't matter. So that's kind of where that's where I'm split on the issue, and I don't know. But the problem is where something like that can lead. I wrote a blog recently that talked about this this just 10 minutes in this documentary where they were talking about harnessing gravitons and using them to communicate with possible extra-dimensional entities. Or what we would say spiritual, and that's something that I talk about in Quantum Creation. When we look at what those two words actually mean, spiritual and extra-dimensional, they're synonymous. They mean the same thing. Scientists will never, well, most scientists, some will, most scientists will never admit that extra-dimensional really means spiritual, just like most Christians aren't going to, be real keen on the idea that extra-dimensional really means spiritual. So that's where that dichotomy is. But really, they do mean the same thing. So when they're sending, if they're trying to communicate with extra-dimensional entities and find out if anything exists, they're trying to communicate with spiritual entities, and that is something that the Bible says not to do. So it's really where is this stuff going to lead?
Well, how are they? I mean, like, how are they trying to communicate with them? Like, verbally, or what? What is the communication?
Well, what they would do is they would use gravitons as a type of binary code. All you'd have to do is say, if you have like a particle, a graviton, you could change the spin, and then you could have ones and zeros basically. So what the idea is that they could send a binary code, made of gravitons, into another dimension and see if anything over there picks it up, or see if anything sends anything back. That's the idea of how they would communicate. Now, as far as what they would say or what I have no idea. I could only speculate on that. But so that's where these types of things could potentially lead. They are. You can even go on the CERN website. They are planning on using the Large Hadron Collider and other colliders in the future to look for extra dimensions. So that's something too.
Hold on, Josh. We're at break. We'll be right back.
Yep.
All right. Before we went to break, you had mentioned, Josh, that if in utilizing CERN, if the scientists were to bring forth some spiritual entities or extraterrestrial or whatever, interdimensional, that possible communication could be done along the lines of utilizing binary code. Well, the question I wanted to ask you is, are you familiar with the incident that happened in Rendlesham Forest, where one of the military personnel, he had spotted an unidentified craft, had landed in the forest, and upon touching it, he was flooded with this binary code that was so burned to his memory that he was able to remember 15 pages, I believe it was 15 pages of this code, and he wrote it down, a series of zeros and ones, and wrote it all down and saved it in a notebook. And it wasn't until recently, I believe it was in 2010, that the first part of his code was deciphered. And then in 2014, there was a book written about the remaining 11 pages of code. And supposedly what the message said after it was deciphered by somebody that was able to do that with the binary code, because the individual that wrote it all down had no idea that there was even a message behind it. But once it was decoded, supposedly it says exploration of humanity, unclear 8100. There's a bunch of, as far as latitude and longitude, and that it's supposed to link up to certain coordinates here on the Earth. The other portion, as far as the decipherment. It says continuous for planetary advance, fourth coordinate continuous, origin year 8100, eyes of your eyes, and then there's a bunch of different longitude and latitude coordinates, and I'm not sure what they all hook up to. I have not read the book, but I just wanted to ask you if first, if you were aware of this, and if you were, what was your take on it?
Yeah, I'm familiar with. I haven't heard the most recent stuff from 2014, but I remember hearing about it a few years ago. I think one of the first locations was to a place called High Brazil, which if I'm remembering right, was an island that had gotten flooded or something in ancient times, and people were making possible connections with Atlantis with that. And I do remember watching an interview with one of the guys that had the experience, and he believes that the message came from us, but from the future, and I guess the year 8100 or whatever it said in there. And so now he's convinced that UFOs and things are actually us from the future. So yeah, I'm familiar with the story. My personal take on it is I think that there are entities that exist that are extremely deceptive because
Right.
they're concerned about their own what their own needs are, what their own wants are, and putting us into deception to further their own goals. That I don't think they have any worry about that. That's just what they do. And the reason that I believe that, not only because that's what I believe that the Bible says, but also they don't seem to be able to get their story straight. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 40 or 50 years ago, that they were telling people that they were from Mars and Venus and all these really close places. But now that we can actually see those places, now they're saying that they're even from further away, like Arcturus or Zeta Reticuli or something like that. And we have no way of vetting that. We have no way. We just have to take their word for it, and most people do. I don't. I think if it's easy for a human to lie, it would be just as easy for some other entity to lie. I don't see any reason to take their word for it. Also, they've been telling people, when a lot of times they'll abduct somebody and say, you're special, you're chosen, tell the world that we're going to show ourselves on this certain date. And then that person goes and does it and gets a big following, and then that date comes and goes, and the entities don't reveal themselves, and the people look foolish. And I don't think that the people are foolish. I just think that they were lied to, unfortunately. So I mean that kind of shows the nature of these things, these entities that we're dealing with. So if they are passing a message along to somebody saying that they're us from the future, I really, there's just no real reason to just take it at face value and believe it. But I mean, that's just my perspective. I mean, I don't look down on people who choose to believe that. I just don't. I personally, I like to have more evidence to go on, and all the evidence that I've that I've collected, and even from personal experience, I've found nothing but it's just deception all around. So that's that's kind of how that's my take on that. But yeah, I'm familiar with the story, and I'm going to have to look more into that because I didn't know that there was anything as recent as last year. But it is interesting though that they used binary to communicate that. So they obviously do understand binary. If we were to try to send a message, it would, I would assume it would be received. Now, whether they'll send anything back or not, who knows, or what they'll send back, we probably wouldn't be able to trust it anyway. But, I think that falls under the lines of things that, mankind and humanity really shouldn't be messing around with. I feel if these things were really benevolent and if these things wanted our good, they're fully capable of communicating with us. They've been doing so since the ancient past. They're fully capable. We shouldn't. We the less technological species or whatever you'd want to call it, it shouldn't be up to us to go seek them out. But it seems like a lot of times they expect that. So, I mean, and I think that we probably will get to a point where we'll use technology to try to do things like that. So something to keep our eyes on, and that's just one of many possible outcomes that have people nervous about the Large Hadron Collider. There's this goes on a whole other tangent, but there's this idea that consciousness might be an interaction of the field, and the Bible, as far as I know, it doesn't really have anything clear to say about that. I mean, it depends on what a person defines consciousness as. If it's just our spirit and that's it, well, then that's not an interaction in the field. That's something extra dimensional, really. But consciousness in itself, a lot of times the physicists and people that are researching this, they're looking at it from a view outside of God. So there is no soul or spirit. There's just the body, and there's consciousness. Well, there's an idea, and it's not widely accepted or anything. It's almost regarded as pseudoscience, but a lot of things even 5-10 years ago that were considered pseudoscience are being seriously considered now. So it wouldn't surprise me if they started really looking into this. But there's let me look at my notes so I can get the right terms here. There's a physicist who I actually really like his work a lot. I just don't agree with all of his conclusions, and that's one of the biggest things that we need to keep in mind too when it comes to science. There's a difference between observation and interpretation. A scientist can make observations and record those observations, and that's fine to take that as truth and everything. But when they start adding in their own interpretations on what that means, what those observations mean, that's where we have the right to not accept that. Like for example, a physicist that I like, his name is Sean Carroll. Definitely not a Christian at all, but I like his work. He's brilliant. And he talks a lot about quantum field theory, and he teaches a lot of good science about it. But their problem is he at times will put his own interpretation and say, well, because quantum field theory is true, which I agree with him there, that disproves an afterlife. There can't be an afterlife because of quantum field theory, because there's no particle to take information anywhere. And that's where I disagree, because that's his interpretation. That's not a scientific fact. That's his opinion. So it's important for us to be able to separate actual science, like the observation, from interpretation. And if we're being fair, I do that too. I put my own interpretation on science, and mine's from a biblical worldview. We all do that. It's a human thing to do. So I'm not necessarily faulting him as a person for that. Just that a lot of times the church will be wary about science because they have a lot of really anti-biblical, anti-Christian interpretations of their own science. So, we tend to think we have to throw the whole thing out, but really we just got to get rid of their interpretations and replace them with what we're more comfortable with. So anyway, going back to the consciousness thing, even Sean Carroll admitted that that's the one thing that physicists haven't been able to crack yet. What is consciousness? And there's an idea that it's really an interaction in a field, kind of like the Higgs field gives mass. This field, it's called quantum brain dynamics. That's what the study of this is called. And that's the theory that states that a new quantum field would be responsible for consciousness. And that hypothetical field is called the cortical field. And then the particle that would be associated are known as corticons. So if that turns out to be true, it really would just take the right amount of energy in the Large Hadron Collider and sensitive enough detectors to be able to find out if that's true, because they would be able to detect it. But also the thing to think about is if they're creating these corticon things and fluctuations in the cortical field, are they creating consciousness? So the reason I think that they're starting to get interested in this is because there are a lot of other scientific ventures that are trying to look into artificial intelligence, and it's a really expensive study. Because it's just all the code, and I'm not a computer expert or anything, but there's just a lot of work with something like that. And our best attempts so far bring I think it's I forget the name of it, the Asaro robot, I think in Japan is like the best of the best that we have now, and it has the intelligence of like a cockroach. So we're not, we're far from where they want to be. Now, if it turns out that these corticon things are actually exist, and that's what the cortical field is, what interaction with the cortical field is what creates consciousness. If they could utilize that, they would just have to create vibrations in the cortical field within a computer, and that would be artificial intelligence. It would be better than artificial intelligence, because it wouldn't be artificial, it would be real consciousness. Now, whether that would have a soul or I have no idea. I don't know if you can even have consciousness without God directing it. And so, it's all really speculative, but that's another area that of things that they're looking at where, it could go ugly. We just don't know.
All right. I've got two questions for you. First, one has to do with the strong delusion, as mentioned in the Bible, and this great deception that is brought about because people have not a love for the truth. Do you see that as being connected to the whole premise that is being put forth by shows such as the Ancient Aliens, and that the so-called extraterrestrials, which I equate them to being, the rebel angels that were cast out of the heavens, the fallen angels, and even the watchers that left their place of habitation, but so much of the world is ready to buy into the belief that they are the creators of humanity. And the whole supposition is being put forth that the reason we haven't found this so-called missing link, this, evolutionary missing link between humanity and the ape, is because the ancient aliens were the ones that jumped the gun on evolution, and so there's this new neoteric theology being put forth that God is an ancient alien, and also that Jesus Christ, Yeshua, was an ascended master or part of the Anunnaki clan, these those that were here before the creation of modern humanity. Let me get you to answer that first, and then I'll pose another question.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree about what the supposed extraterrestrials are. I equate them also to the same things, fallen angels and watchers and spirits of dead Nephilim and things like that. Right. But yeah, absolutely. I do believe that this is all part of the Great Deception, and for all the reasons that you listed and more. And I've been thinking recently, it wouldn't surprise me, because it seems like the more time goes by and the more that we're able to check things out and the more that we have time to kind of think, just as humanity, the further away these entities have to say that they're from, because we start thinking about it, and not everything adds up. It wouldn't surprise me when our disclosure is actually going to happen, whether it's going to be we'll wake up one day and there's going to be a bunch of flying saucers in the sky, or whether it's going to be more gradual over the course of a couple generations, or whether it's going to be an announcement from a government or something like that. However it happens, it really wouldn't surprise me if the entities actually do say that they're extra dimensional, that they're from another dimension, and that they are using these planets as just kind of bases and things like that. I with all as much study as I've done, it seems like their process is to get as close to the truth as they can while still making it a lie, because that's how we'll accept it the best. A good liar knows how to use the truth to support his lie. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they do come out and say that they are from a higher dimension, and really spirituality is just a super physicality or something like that, because if they do that, they'll have the corner not only on material science, but also on spiritual advancement. They would be the authorities on both sides of the coin. Or they might just say that they're from another planet. I mean, I don't really know. It depends, which abductee you talked, or really which abductee, whatever being they have talked to. They say different things. So. But yeah, I do believe that that's all connected with the Great Deception. I believe that that's how, the enemy is gonna grab hold of the world. And I think that he's gonna wait. He'll probably wait for some type of cataclysm, maybe a world war, or a natural thing. I don't know, but I think that most likely there will be some cataclysm, and then that the world will be left in a place where we have no one else to turn to. Then these things will show up, and I could see it going down like that. Yeah, I definitely believe it's all connected.
All right, this other question, which we'll have a break come up at 8:57, so you got about 5 minutes to answer this, and then I'm going to tie this into a question that Link had posed in the chat room. Her question, or he, I'm not sure, is, I wonder what Josh's take is on the flat earth stuff. Now, I wanted to ask you, as far as the strong delusion too, and the rebel angels, fallen angels claim of being far out there, or from another dimension, or another planet in a far off solar system. In your answer on the flat earth, do you think that if we are on a geocentric earth, and that everything was created to be as far as like the clockwork above us, if the rebel angels, the fallen angels, are blocked to this time and space, and they can't escape the judgment that is coming?
Yeah, I can see that. And I'll preface my answer by saying I don't personally have a problem with somebody believing in a flat Earth. I personally don't. I'm a sphere guy, I guess, but I don't have a problem at all with somebody. I understand why people believe that. There are a lot of questions. And I actually just did an interview with Rob Skiba on my show, The Sharpening. If people are interested, it's youtube.com/Josh Peck Disclosure. I did a show with Rob where we pretty much just talked about every aspect of the flat Earth theory for about 3 hours, and it was a good show. It was really controversial. I really wasn't expecting the backlash that came from that, but
yeah.
but it was, in my opinion, it was an interesting show. It was fun. I got to learn more about the theory and why people believe in it. For me personally, I guess I would need more evidence, but I'm not going to be so like prideful in my own intelligence to say that I know the truth and it's not flat. It can't be. I'm not going to do that. I'm pretty open to possibilities like that. So just because I don't believe in the theory doesn't mean I don't believe in the possibility of the theory, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
but no, I'm still a hardcore sphere, universe expanding, all that stuff. Pretty much what mainstream science, for the most part, says I adhere to, just not when it comes to the Bible and Scripture and all that. So that's a short answer for you.
Yeah, no problem, Josh. We're at a break, so hold on to that thought. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen, and I have as guest with me this evening, Josh Peck. I do want to remind the listening audience that we do need your monetary support, and that if you can, to please go to freedomslips.com and support us in any way that you can with donations by either subscribing to the archives or purchasing the various products, non-GMO seed pack, the archival disc of your favorite host from either Studio A or Studio B. There's a lot of things out there that you can do to stand with us as a platform of truth and helping us to continue to bring forth the interesting information and the cutting edge current events and news broadcasts that we bring forth from all the various hosts, an eclectic variety and myriad different perspectives on all the most important topics that can be talked about, found, and discussed on the internet and in the world. And so please, if you can, do go to freedomslips.com and support us. And it'll help us to go a long way in the next step of the evolution, which will be going satellite 24/7. So, anyways, Josh, I wanted to ask you one other question before we leave the topic as far as of CERN. Do you subscribe to the view that like there was a movie just recently, Interstellar, and they talked about how the black hole would possibly be a gateway or a doorway to another dimension, and others also speculate that stars themselves, such as even our sun, is a possible wormhole and a gateway to a different dimension.
Yeah, they very well might be. And, if this was just, if I was asked this question even a couple of weeks or a month ago, I would have said no way, especially with black holes, because the gravity is just it's just too intense. But now I haven't looked into this myself yet, but I recently did an interview with Chris Putnam, and he and Tom Horn just wrote a book on the path of the immortals. And one of the topics that they talk about is black holes. And so we talked about that topic on the show because I have a big interest in things like that. And I guess Chris brought up that recent scientific evidence is showing that the centrifugal force of the black hole might be strong enough to cancel out the gravity, the crushing gravity of black holes. And if that's true, they might actually, at least some of them, might actually be stable and can be used as as wormholes to God only knows where. But so I thought that was really interesting. So that caused me to have to rethink the idea that the gravity would be too intense. So I don't know. I haven't looked into it myself, but I know the work of Chris Putnam and Tom Horn really well, and I trust it. So I wouldn't have any reason to suspect there was anything going on there. So I believe that that's accurate. But so yeah, I mean it very well could be. And as far as the sun, I haven't heard that, but it would make sense because of how much gravity there is in the center of the sun. And if we're talking about extra dimensional beings that the Bible makes reference to seraphim that are basically made of fire, the heat wouldn't seem to bother them. So yeah, that's really interesting. But yeah, I do agree with that.
All right. Just a couple other questions before we go into your work on the cherubim chariots.
Sure.
What do you think about like the prior times? Do you subscribe into the belief that what is being described in Genesis 1, chapter 1 and verse 1 and chapter 1 and verse 2, that the earth becoming null and void, that it wasn't created that way, and that something led to the destruction of the earth, and that there was a prior generation or era or epoch of time which led to the verse 2 of the earth becoming null and void? That's my first question.
Yeah, when it comes to that, I feel like I'm I can relate to Mulder on the X-Files. I want to believe. I really do. I mean that to me that's a more interesting story, and in a lot of ways it does make a lot more sense, but for me, I there's too many things in scripture that would have to be answered for all of that. And now I'm not saying that I'm not open to the possibility. I greatly am open to the possibility, and I'm hoping to be convinced of that someday, because I don't know, that would just be really interesting. That opens up a whole another world of study. But and I really like the work of David Flynn, who got into a lot of that stuff. And everything that I've read of his, I agree with, but I'm still a young Earth creationist, so I don't know how how that can match up. But I do believe, at the very least, I do believe that there were angels or extra dimensional entities before humans were made, and the Book of Genesis doesn't really give us a clear definition of time between the creation of the earth and all that, and then the first day of creation. So there could be things that happened in that that whatever that span of time might have been. But something else that I'm also looking into, this is for when I write books, I plan like 2 or 3 ahead at a time. I've been thinking about writing a book that would be it would kind of be a counterpart to quantum creation. And in quantum creation, I dealt mainly with the quantum world, but I probably the next book after the one I'm working on now, I want to look more at a cosmology, things on the macro scale. But one thing that I'm really interested in is time and how time works, especially in out in the universe. Now it's possible, and this is really speculative. It's possible that due to the way because movement and speed and even gravity can affect time. So I think that if we think that time is a constant, we're under a false assumption there. Einstein proved that it's not. You can alter it in different ways. So we might live in a reality where young Earth creation and old Earth creation are both accurate. The Earth might be young and the universe might be billions of years old. But it really has to do with the perspective of time and how time actually works. It's not just a steady flowing thing. It can be sped up and slowed down depending on how things move and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but
No, I appreciate you taking the time to give us your thoughts on these things. Now, as far as when do you think, as far as the war in heaven, give us your thought and your belief on that. Did you think that the rebel angels, Lucifer, that they were cast out of the heavens before the creation of modern humanity? And I also wanted to tie into this with this particular question, your thoughts on the megalithic structures, not only here on the earth, but the possibility of their existence, and with David Flynn's work on Cydonia, and in the possible existence of megalithic structures both on the moon and Mars. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that keeps pulling me towards wanting to believe in an older creation, because
Right.
I do believe that there are structures on the moon and especially on Mars. The Dave Flynn's study into the face on Mars is just so groundbreaking and phenomenal. I really got a lot out of that. And I referenced it a lot in Cherubim Chariots as well, so that we could even get into that in a little bit. But
Yes.
but to answer that question, as far as the war in heaven and the rebellion, I'm not sure exactly when that happened. It was, I would imagine it was sometime before the creation of Adam and Eve, because God did create the 2 trees. There was the tree of life and then the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he did that to give Adam and Eve an option to disobey him, because we don't really have free will if we don't have the freedom to do what we want to do, even if it's against God, And God made it pretty easy. It's just you can do anything you want, just don't eat from that one tree.
Right.
So I mean, how much easier could it have been? But just we're human and we're flawed, and so at that time, Eve was tempted. So the rebellion must have happened sometime before that. How far back? I really have no idea. I mean, it does say in Job that during the creation, when God was creating the earth and stuff, that the sons of God were singing and all that stuff. So it would seem that the angels might have been the first things that were created, maybe even before the earth.
Right.
So a rebellion could have happened sometime before there, but it also going really deep into it, when was time created? And even that question in itself is flawed, because when would be, well, at the beginning. You don't have a when if you don't already have time. God exists and creates. He does that outside of time. Now he can go in time as however he likes. It's his creation, but time itself by nature, that's just a creation of God's. So whether angels were created outside of time or not, I don't believe they were. I believe that they were created inside of time as well, just probably definitely higher dimensions. But now what I do believe is when the rebellion did happen and they were kicked out of heaven, and this is something that I talk about in Quantum Creation, I believe that they fell to what physicists would now call the fourth spatial dimension. Now we know that the fourth dimension is time, but that's when we're grouping all dimensions together, spatial or dimensions of space and temporal dimensions of time. Then time is the fourth dimension. But if we're just talking about spatial dimensions, there's a fourth spatial dimension too. An illustration that I use in the book to kind of help get our heads around this. If we think of spatial dimensions, we have three that we live in. There's side to side, forward, backward, up and down. The X, Y, and Z axes. A fourth dimension would be some other two other directions that are perpendicular to those. Now we can't imagine that. That's impossible to picture because we have limited perception. But physicists, through a variety of mathematical way, they've been able to show that the higher dimensions do exist. For a long time, they were thought to be just minuscule, like curled up, But recent research, a physicist named Lisa Randall has done some really, really good research showing how extra dimensions could actually be as large as our own, or even infinite in size. So that's fascinating too. But I believe that when they fell, they were cast down to the fourth spatial dimension because there seems to be a split between the third and the fourth, because we can't perceive the fourth at all. We perceive the first, second, and third just fine, but after that, we're basically clueless. And then in Revelation, when they're cast down to the earth, I believe that that's when they will be cast down once again, but this time to the three dimensions of space that we inhabit, and they'll be stuck here just like we are. And that'll be a horrifying time, to say the least. But as far as right now, it seems like they've been cast down, I believe, and this is just me speculating, to the fourth spatial dimension, and they have various means of getting here. I mean, there have been reports of psychics and things opening these portals by meditation and stuff, where they can come through in that way, and that goes back to the New Age stuff that I used to practice, and I thank God that I don't anymore. I about ruined my life with that stuff, but again, that's just me personally. I'm not one to judge anybody who might practice that. I wouldn't recommend it, but so that was about 10 different tangents for you.
That was really great, and I just have one other, and then we're going to go into the cherubim chariots. And this just has to do with, have you studied like the pseudepigraphal, the extra biblical, extra canonical texts? And the reason I mention this is because in the second book of Enoch, the book of the secrets of Enoch, it mentions in chapter 29 and 30 that the rebel angels the 1/3 that joined Lucifer in rebellion, that they were cast out of the heavens on the second day after the separation of light and darkness, and before, and that they were cast out over the bottomless before the creation of the earth, and all that unfolded afterwards.
Yeah, and that's definitely interesting too. And the way that I look at extra biblical text, I used to be, because I was raised Baptist, I used to be completely against them, but I'm not anymore. I don't think that they're on the same level as like the books in the Bible. I don't believe they necessarily, but I look at them more as like history books. And, we even have history books that are in school that just talk about America's history the last couple hundred years, and some are extremely accurate and some are full of errors. So, right. But I do, at least with Enoch, because it's been quoted so much in the Bible, and the book of Jasher, for me, I look at those as like in between, just history books and inspired scripture. Like, I think It's a little better than history, but still not quite. But yeah, and I've heard people who haven't even looked into the book of Enoch that have said, just from the Bible, that have been able to deduce that the angelic rebellion would have happened, on the second day, and that's when they would have been cast out. So that's a perfectly valid view to have, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if it turns out that's true.
All right. Well, I'd like for you to tell us about your book, Cherubim Chariots, and let's talk about that. And also, if anybody would like to call in to ask Josh a question about any of his work or his books, or to share commentary with us, to call in 310-421-4053, and you can speak with him directly. But until then, Josh, if you would, set the premise, lay the foundation for Cherubim Chariots.
Sure. So I mainly wanted to look at, there are shows like Ancient Aliens and things like that really, they really promote the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Right.
And there's another hypothesis, as I talked about at the top of the show, called the extra-dimensional hypothesis. And, There are non-Christian researchers that, even without any Bible framework or anything, that there are plenty of people that subscribe to the extra-dimensional hypothesis, because it really does make more sense. The ETH, extraterrestrial hypothesis, it seems to make more sense on the surface, but when you really look into it, and the type.
Josh, are you still there?
People are reporting can easily be true, and without any excuse the pun, but godlike technology. So I wanted to look at and there are researchers like Jacques Vallée that, he's not like a Christian or anything, but he subscribes to the extra dimensional hypothesis because it just makes more sense. I think a lot of the problem why it's not widely accepted is because I don't think it's ever really been, at least in the UFO community, I don't think it's ever really been explained well enough what an extra dimension actually is. It's not anything that has to be super esoteric or mysterious or something that only certain people can understand, or it doesn't have to be anything like that. Basically what I said earlier about the fourth spatial dimension, it's really just two extra directions that we can't perceive. It's just another axis. And we can't perceive it. Now, the absolute best way of understanding higher dimensions that I've ever come across, it's an example that basically every physicist that I've ever read or have looked into or even have talked to will use to explain these things, is a book that was written in the late 1800s called Flatland. And basically, it's a fictional story about a two-dimensional universe called Flatland, a two-dimensional world, and the main character, his name is A Square. So he's literally a square. Flatland consists of just the X and Y axis. There's no Z axis. There's no up and down. Well, later on through the story, a square comes in contact with a three-dimensional being, a person. So it explores the idea of how would this extra-dimensional entity, this.
Hold on, caller.
It might. Sorry, what?
I was just telling the caller to hold on. They can ask you a question or comment after you're finished with your thought.
Sure. So the main idea behind the story is how can an extra dimensional entity explain itself or describe itself to something that's of a lower dimension. So let's say you had a three-dimensional ball and it were to pass through Flatland. What would that look like to a Flatlander? Well, the Flatlander would see just a point appear right in front of him, and then it would grow into it would be a circle, but from his perspective, it would look like a line. But he would be able to, decipher that it's a circle. And then that circle would grow as the ball is passing through, and then as the ball was leaving out the other side, the circle would shrink and disappear. Now, isn't it interesting that if you just take that in one dimension higher, that's what a lot of the UFO reports will say. They say that a lot of these craft they seem to shrink and grow and change shape and do all these weird things that shouldn't be physically possible. But if it's coming from a higher dimension, all they're doing is passing through our dimension, but that's how we would perceive it, just as a Flatlander would perceive a ball as a series of as a ever-changing circle. So that's the best way of trying to wrap our heads around what an extra dimension is and how to think about it. That's the best example I've given. I'll let the caller ask his question, and then we can. I know.
All
we're
right,
almost
area
on break,
code 703. Where are you calling from, and did you have a question or a comment for Josh?
I'm calling from Alexandria, Virginia, and my question is probably going to open a can of worms, but my question is, everything in the Bible or in the scriptures is witness. Is that right or correct?
Josh?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, well then the question that I have then is, who was the witness, who or what was the witness for when Moses went up on the mount and got the Ten Commandments? And of course, he disappeared twice for a 40-day period. And there were no prophecies that I can find of or prophets that were beforehand. And there is no accounting after the fact either. And there were no angels that witnessed that account either. And I was just wondering what either of your thoughts were on that.
Hold on. We're at a break. Hold on, caller. Hold on, Josh. We'll be right back, everyone.
Sure.
All right, welcome back, everybody, for final segment. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. I have as guest with me Josh Peck. Caller, can you ask that question one more time?
Okay. The question that I have basically is questioning the witnessing of when Moses got the Ten Commandments given to him, or however it was given to him. Anyways, I just have not been able to find where there is a prophecy or angel witnesses or any kind of confirmation by visionaries or anything after the fact on that. And that causes me concern, because both of you agree that everything in the scriptures is witnessed and backed up by a supporting statement. And I was just wondering what your ideas were on that, or am I way out in left field?
Josh?
No, I think, sure. I think that's a really good question, and that's something I haven't thought of before. But that is a good question. You bring up a really good point. I think what it comes down to is what a witness actually is, because there are things in Genesis, like the creation account, where there's no one but God to witness that. So I for me personally, and this is just my own personal take, I'm fine with just seeing Moses and God as the witnesses. Now that's just me. Other people might not be able to look at it, take it that way. And then as far as the prophecy thing, there's evidence, and that's a really interesting point too that I hadn't thought about before. But there's evidence in the Bible that there have been prophecies made that haven't been recorded in the Bible. An example is when Elijah was taken up in the whirlwind. Before that happened, they had the prophets would come to him and say, hey, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically, hey, did you know you're supposed to go up in the whirlwind today, or God's going to take you out of here today? And he's like, yes, I know, leave me alone. And that's obviously paraphrasing. But now when we look in the Bible, we can't find that prophecy anywhere. There's no prophecy, but apparently there was at one time a known prophecy. So for me, it would stand to reason if I wouldn't assume that was an isolated incident. I'm sure there were, if there was that prophecy that wasn't recorded in the Bible, there could have been plenty of them. But that's just pure speculation on my part. But off the top of my head, I guess that would be the best thing that I could give as an answer.
I would say that God himself was the witness to the Ten Commandments being given to Moses. And the reason I say this is because originally, before Moses smashed them down, being just totally upset with the people, and they're creating the golden calf and having gone back to worshiping pagan idols, is that the Ten Commandments were written in such a way that the Most High himself had completed the task. And it was only after they were broken that Moses had carved out, had however chiseled out the second set of commandments, but the first were done in such a way that it was verification that the finger of God, or the Spirit of the Most High, the divine providence of the Most High, was the one that had performed that work. And so they would have stood as being supernatural and divinely inspired, and would have been confirmation as to the Moses actually meeting with God and receiving those commandments from him. But because of the disgust for their having fallen away in 40 days and taken back up pagan practices and worshiping idols again, that incredible testament was destroyed. Caller, does that kind of answer your question?
Well, in other words, you're saying that the actual tablets themselves are the witness, but the tablets have been destroyed and nobody has seen them since.
Right.
So we really don't have a witness unless there was an eyewitness that wrote about witnessing that.
Right.
So, in other words, we don't have a witness for Moses.
Right.
That's where I started.
Yeah. Well, I'm agreeing with you. But, if the tablets wouldn't have been destroyed, then, for certain, they would have stood as a testament. And supposedly, those are the ones that were going to be interned into the Ark of the Covenant, so that whenever it is brought forth, that they would have been, testament as to his receiving those commandments from God. But because they were destroyed, we again have to go by faith and have to, assume that he was meeting with God, and that the commandments that he brought forth and the laws and the decree and having written the Torah, that all that stands as a testament to his having done so.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for your answers.
You're welcome, brother. God bless you, and thanks for calling in.
God bless you, too. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. All right, Josh, I wanted to, before we get too far, I wanted to give you a chance to give out your website information once more, and to, your book. I know you've got a lot of books, but just mention maybe the couple that couple few that are the most important to you, and where people can go to support you and your work as far as that. Listen to your podcast, and then we'll continue on because a couple other questions I want to bring forth.
Yeah, absolutely. My website is ministudyministry.com, and all my information can be found there. People can even email me if they want, joshpeckdisclosure@gmail.com, and I will write back. I make a point to do that. And but yeah, all the information about my show is on ministudyministry.com. The show is called The Sharpening, and if people want to check it out directly, they can go to youtube.com/Josh Peck Disclosure. And probably the two or three most, I think the two or three that most people seem to get a lot out of are Disclosure, my first one, and then especially Quantum Creation and Cherubim Chariots. And actually right now, Skywatch TV has put together a package deal, and the link is right there on my website, but where you can get both books for only, I think it's $29.95, which is a lot cheaper than if you were to buy it separately from me. So people should definitely do that, and that does actually help me out a great deal. The more people get that package deal. So I don't think I mentioned it before. I put together a gospel harmony a couple years ago, and basically what a gospel harmony is it's an attempt to take the four gospels and put them into a single narrative. And what makes mine a little unique is most gospel harmonies, they'll do it by columns. They'll separate each gospel out by columns. So when you open the book, you have four columns in front of you, and they'll split the verses up. And for me, it's confusing to read. So what I did was each gospel has a different font emphasis. So there's just regular type and then bold, underline, and italics. So you can read the whole. And I don't take any verses out or add any verses in. I don't tamper with it in that way. I've done my best to try to put it all in chronological order. There's also an ebook version that's color coded, so some people find that a little easier to read. So a lot of people have been able to get a lot out of that too. But yeah, I didn't actually author that. I just arranged it, I guess. God authored it, but it's just an arrangement of the gospel. So. But yeah, that's and then people can also get a hold of me on Facebook. I'm always on Facebook, probably way more than I need to be. But people can find me on there as well.
Okay, wonderful. And another question as far as the esoteric nature of what we're dealing with, as far as the New World Order and the Revelation 12 mention of the devil and Satan, and how it describes this particular entity, this being, which we know that he was the Genesis 3, the serpent, the shining one, is the mention of him as being an ancient dragon, that old serpent. Do you ascribe to the belief that the reptilians have something to do with the Nakash, or the serpent, and that Satan or Lucifer, that they are embodied in this dragon-like form, and that also the worship of the feathered serpent worldwide is connected to him having deceiveth the whole world?
Definitely, and a lot of ufology, and especially a lot of abductees, they'll say that the reptilians are on the top. Well, they'll either say that or the mantis ones. I'm still not quite sure what to do with with the mantis ones. I don't know. The closest thing I can come to, and it's not a great explanation, so it's probably not fully accurate, is maybe the locusts of Revelation 9. But I've done a whole study into the locusts of Revelation 9. I don't believe the locusts have anything to do with their appearance. And I don't see anything mantis-like in there, so I don't know what to do with them. But the reptilians, a lot of people say that they're the most evil one. They're the ones that are on top and in control of this whole thing. The interesting thing is when you look into what the Nakash actually was, or is, I should say, it seems that there was a type of angel, a class of angel, or we might even say species of angel that was reptilian in nature. And
Right.
I don't know if all of them fell or if it was just a few. And that shouldn't surprise us too much, because there are. In the book of Ezekiel, it talks about a class of angel called the Ophanim, and you got to go into the Hebrew to get that. But the wheels, those aren't just mechanical; those are actual beings. Those are angels that look like wheels, with eyes all around them. So, heaven's a lot weirder than we probably give it credit for, but in a good way. But anyway, so and actually that goes back to something Chris Putnam actually posted recently too. He did a study into the seraphim, and through that was able to show how there was a class of angels, or is a class of angels that are reptilian in appearance. Dr. Michael Heiser has done some great work in those regards as well. So, but I believe that when those angels fell, I don't know if every reptilian angel, fell. I mean, I would imagine so, because so much of the world had, and all the false religions have their deity as some type of reptilian, being. And you never really hear of any good ones. So, but yeah, I absolutely do believe there's a connection there, and I think that that's what the Bible is describing.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you on that, and I think for people that are trying to go up to and ask their pastors or their preacher or whoever they look up to for interpretation on the word, I mean, for most people, if you give any kind of credence to there being reptilians, as far as the presence of them on this particular planet, or that they are the overseers, the controllers of the matrix, and the what we are born into as far as being assimilated into this fallen state of being in this fallen world, they absolutely think that you're crazy or that this is complete lunacy. But this is the reality that the Bible has described. Even, specifically with Revelation 12, the description of Satan and as being the devil as being this ancient serpent, this ancient dragon, and that there's so much of this reptilian terminology found within the text. And so I absolutely believe that this is what it is referencing when it makes this connection, and that those that are really trying to study and look into truth, you have to open yourself to this possibility, or you're going to miss so much of what is the other side of it. Your comment, and then if you would, let's go back into the premise of your work as far as the cherubim chariots.
Sure, yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. That's absolutely right. And, unfortunately, it really speaks to the state of the church today, where in the mainstream church, you can't ask questions like that and be taken seriously. That's what made me fall away from the church to begin with when I was about 12 years old, because my biggest question, as, I've always loved science fiction, and, it was just something that as a kid was really important to me. My biggest question was, what are aliens and how do they fit in the Bible? If at all, and if they don't exist, how does that fit into the Bible? My biggest question was about aliens, and the only answer that I ever really got was, well, they're just demons. Okay, well, where does it say that though? I mean, how do you know that? Like, what are you basing that on? And then it would just be, well, Josh, you just got to take it on faith. And that was always kind of like the cop-out answer, like the way that was their way, kind of like saying I don't know, but I don't want to say I don't know. And, because of that, in my book Disclosure, I said one of the most important things that we can learn is to say I don't know. And a good example is the question that caller had. I don't know. I mean, that he had a really good question. That's something that I want to look into more, because I on the surface, I have ideas, but I really don't know. So that's one of the most important things that, the church as a whole should just learn how to admit that we don't know everything. And through that, we can learn to accept some other people's point of view. Like I remember growing up, I grew up with like the pre-trib rapture belief, and I still I still am pre-trib, not trying to open that can of worms or anything, but I just personal preference, I guess. I still am, but I went through I went through about a year of study after I got out of my traditional mindset and started questioning everything, where I really wanted to know, well, is the pre-trib rapture actually biblically? And for that whole year, there was a time throughout that whole year where I believed in each and every one of the 3 or 4 primary rapture beliefs. There was a time that I was post-trib. There was a time I was pre-wrath. There was a time I was mid. There was, eventually I just, after a lot of prayer and study, I just didn't really get a direct answer. And in that, the way that I looked at it was, maybe we're not supposed to know the direct answer, and we just got to learn to get along with each other. So I just went back to pre-trib, and that, that's what I believe now. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be prepared, because we need to be prepared. But so yeah, I mean, just going back to the whole thing with the church not being able to ask questions. A lot of people have questions about aliens and things like that, and when their church isn't providing an answer, then they go to things like Ancient Aliens, and they start getting more New Age and more Gnostic. And I've known people personally, like really good friends, that have fallen away from the church and ended up denying Jesus because Gnosticism or Ancient Aliens or New Age makes more sense to them, because at least they're given some kind of answer, and so it's unfortunate that the church has to be that way, and that's one of the main reasons that I do what I do. I want to always be able to provide an answer, even if it's I don't know.
Yes, absolutely, and I agree with you that so many are turning their backs on the scriptures because they don't believe that the answers are found within the gospel, but they are. It's just that so many don't understand or don't see it that way. They've not been opened up to the greater insight that is contained within, in my opinion. We've got about 5 minutes remaining, Josh. So I want to give you a chance, for final commentary. And also, if you would, talk a little bit about what you see coming as far as the near term and what the future holds.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something really important too, because a lot of the church doesn't talk about prophecy, and that's something that we need to be focused on. I mean, it was a third of Jesus' ministry. If you break it down, it was prophecy. So it's definitely important, especially in the day and age that we live in. And I wrote more about prophecy and cherubim chariots than I did quantum creation. Which was strange for me, because I'm really big into prophecy. Quantum creation doesn't have a whole lot, but cherubim chariots does. One of the main, I really believe that whatever is coming our way is going to have something to do with quantum physics. And the reason that I believe that, I actually, and I wrote about this in cherubim chariots. I believe there's like a type of hidden prophecy in the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel that talks a little bit about that, because in the book of Ezekiel, he talks about seeing these angels, but they're melded together. They share one leg, and their faces are kind of melded together. And I dedicated a huge portion of the book really breaking that entire chapter down of what he was seeing. Well, Ezekiel, and this was I think 2,600 years ago or something like that, when Ezekiel had this amazing vision. And this really speaks to the legitimacy of the Bible. He didn't know it at the time, because Ezekiel was not a quantum physicist, but he was describing something called extra-dimensional unfolding. He didn't know that, but basically what that is, it's like the example we used before of higher dimensions. If there was if we have a cube, we could unfold the cube into 2 dimensions, and it would look like a cross, made of 6 squares. So the idea is, well, what about a hypercube, which is a cube of 4 spatial dimensions? If you unfold that into 3 dimensions, it's called a tesseract. It looks like a 3-dimensional cross with 2 extra arms coming out. It's made of 8 cubes. Now imagine if you were to take that and unfold it again into 2 dimensions. Well, now you're having some of those squares take up the same space. They're melding together. And what's really interesting is when you look at the shape that these angels are taking. There's 4 angels with their arms stretched out. It is the shape of a tesseract, which is mind blowing in itself. But it's a double. It's at least a. It's an extra dimensional unfolding, at least 2 dimensions up, because that's when things start taking up the same space. There's no way Ezekiel could have known that. It just goes to show that he really did see what he said he saw. And there's so much more that goes into that, but I think that's a clue to tell us, because there's a lot of prophecy in the book of Ezekiel. Obviously, that's pretty much what the entire book is. I think that might be a clue telling us, when these things are, kind of more understood, we might be approaching the time of the end, or the time where the things that Ezekiel talked about is going to start to happen. But as far as what it's going to look like, there's a lot of different schools of thought. And I personally say, if it lines up with Scripture, at least file it away in the back of your mind, any given interpretation of prophecy, because on this end of it, we just don't know. So that's kind of how I look at it.
Hey, Josh, we're at the end of the show, but I would like to invite you back, because I'd like to talk about this. And, with our being the fig tree generation and what you see coming, I think it would make for an interesting show. But thank you for joining us. I appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was an honor.
We'll talk to you soon. God bless all. Good night. I was involved with the New Age for 20 years before being brought full circle back to the study of these scriptures, and it was actually the Genesis 6, the whole thing with the sons of God mating with the daughters of humanity, that led me back into the study of Scripture, into as well as the extra biblical, extra canonical texts, and everything else that I could find that it had anything in connection to the regular canon, the pseudepigrapha, apocrypha, all those different things as well. So we are similar in our walk in that regard. But if you would, can you let's start off with what it is you think about CERN, and what your research has made you believe is really going on, because I know a lot of people speculate that the CERN device has something to do with opening stargates and the invitation of interdimensional beings into this era and this plane of existence, as described by the similar thing was done during the time of Atlantis with it's described in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth that they open similar kind of things. And so what has your research led you to believe about CERN, and what the agenda, if there is some ulterior motive to all of that?
Yeah, and that's a really, really good question, and that was the question that I had that really that really prompted me to write a book like this, because and even still I see both sides, and now that I understand a little bit more of the science behind it, it does help answer some things, but I'm still a little weary about everything. When I started writing the book, I whenever we look for information on CERN and what they're doing, we get one of 2 extremes. Either we get a totally scientific, where it's like, this is all fine, but here's just the hard science behind it, or we get like the fringiest of the fringe, where people are prophesying that CERN is gonna like blow up the world in a couple months, or we'll get stuff like that. So I really wanted to try to find a common middle, and look at the science, but look at it in terms of the Bible and prophecy as well. And are the things that they're doing, is it okay with God or not okay with God? And to answer that, it really does take it takes a basic understanding of the actual science that of what they're doing, and it really goes all the way back to quantum field theory, which to me is one of the most interesting things. I wrote just a short paragraph pretty much about it in Quantum Creation, but this book, this new book, it's going to be central. Because what quantum field theory states is basically everything in existence, like every elementary particle, which is the smallest of the small when it comes to particles, where you can't divide it anymore. It's not made of anything, which that always confused me. But when you get to the smallest of the small of particles,
most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Pick it up next week. Welcome everybody to Momentary Zen. I'm your host, Zen Garcia, and I thank you for joining me this evening. I have as guest with me Josh Peck, who's also a radio host, broadcaster, and author, and has been on the cutting edge of talking about a lot of the esoteric subjects which are piquing the interest of a lot of people. And so we're going to be talking to him over the course of the next couple hours. And I want to also just let listening audience know that my computer, for whatever reason, is lagging a little bit this evening. And so I just wanted to make you aware. But Josh, are you there, brother?
yes, I am. How are you doing?
I'm doing really good, and I thank you for taking the time to join us and for to coming on our Revolution Radio broadcast. Also, another thing, and I'm not sure if this is because of the lag, but my volume is adjusted weirdly, and so I'm having to listen very hard to hear you. But I want to make sure those of you that are in the chat room, if you would let us know as to the volume level and if you could hear Josh clearly. And then what I might do is on one of the breaks, just reload and then bring Josh back on to see if that fixes my, the volume and the way that it is right now. But Josh, I really, again, appreciate you taking the time to join us. If you would, please let people know about the books that you have written as well as your website and where you do your broadcasts, where people can go to support you in your endeavors.
Yeah, absolutely. My website is www.ministudyministry.com, and I'm going to put that in the chat thing here, so if people are in the chat, they'll have access to it.
All right.
Let me just do that real quick. And I have I have all my books up on there. My first one was called Disclosure. And but really I think what that book was kind of me figuring out how to not write a book. I made all the mistakes in writing that I could possibly make through that, but so it took a lot longer, but it turned out pretty good. And my real first book as a professional, I guess, would be Quantum Creation, and that's the one that kind of set the pace for what I do now. So but yeah, people can get that on ministudyministry.com. I also host a show called The Sharpening. It's primarily on YouTube, but it can also be found on Podomatic as long as the bandwidth limit isn't reached. But I have links to that on my website as well. So again, that's ministudyministry.com.
Okay, wonderful. Well, if you would also just tell us a little bit about what brought you to Revelation as far as the New World Order, and what also led you to the study of biblical prophecy and your interest in the scriptures.
Sure. Well, I've always been interested in prophecy, and I was raised as a Baptist, so they, at least in the church that I was brought up in, they kind of touched on prophecy, but it was really just the more general stuff. It wasn't really anything too specific, but I was still interested in it. And in my teenage years, I kind of got away from the church for a while and went more New Age, I guess. And I really got interested in just all sorts of prophecy. But there was something about specifically scriptural or biblical prophecy that always seemed to resonate more with me, and I think it was mainly because of the overwhelming accuracy of it. It always blew me away. I mean, and if I'm being honest, and I think most Christians, would be honest about that, there are vague, prophecies in the Bible, sure, but there are also extremely specific ones, and things that couldn't be self-fulfilled, right down to the day kind of stuff. And I found even more of those that if you look into the original languages of Hebrew and Greek, you can even pull more of those out. So that really that helped get me kind of back into the Bible stuff, and that along with a lot of other things, but just in a nutshell. So I started studying on my own with my wife, and we found some other researchers that were researching similar areas of prophecy. I think the first one that we came across was L.A. Marzulli, and he was actually available. Like, he kept himself available to be able to talk, so I was able to get a hold of him and chat with him a little bit, because I of course had a lot of questions, and that and along with a lot of other things really put me in a place where I rededicated my life to Jesus. So that's kind of where that's kind of the lens that I look at all of this stuff from, as a biblical lens. But shortly after that, I got really interested in science, and that was another thing that I've always been interested in. But growing up in a church, a lot of times we're taught that science and religion don't mix. So it was almost like I had to pick one or the other. But I married my wife. She was really interested in science, and especially quantum physics. And so a lot of times for date night, we would just put on the Discovery Channel or something like that. And so I became fascinated with this stuff, and I realized the more that I was studying scripture, that there's actually quite a bit of quantum physics in there, and that really blew my mind. The more that I learned about quantum physics, and just from my own private study, and I'm not a scientist or a physicist or anything. It's just more of a hobby, or just an interest of mine. But the more that I looked into that, the more I was seeing a lot of parallels in the Bible. And so over the course of a year or so, I gathered a lot of research and decided to put it in a book, and that was what my book Quantum Creation was all about. One of the biggest things that I realized too is a lot of there were two main things that at first were tearing me away from science. One was that I thought that I couldn't have science and religion at the same time, but also I thought that you had to be a genius to understand that stuff. And I'm certainly no genius, so I had a problem. I was really interested in it, but after my wife got me into some of the stuff she was looking at, and I started to see it for myself, I realized really just a lot of it is based in terminology. They just use a lot of words that we don't normally use, so it's almost like learning a new language. And once you get the hang of that, the concepts behind things like quantum physics are actually pretty simple. So I wanted to write a book that could put those concepts in a way that anybody could understand, and also show how they can apply to spiritual belief. So that was Quantum Creation, just in a nutshell. I guess that's kind of what led me down that road.
Well, tell us about your other books as well, and
Sure.
yeah, and kind of a brief summary of each, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess I should backtrack a little bit, because I had a few books. I actually have 10 or 11 books. I won't go through each one individually, but the first one was Disclosure, and that one was the one where I really wanted to show how a lot of the things that were taught in church traditionally aren't actually biblically true. There were some things that I was brought up with that, you have to have your hair cut a certain length, or you can't wear jeans on Sunday, or just kind of ridiculous stuff like that. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there are deeper theological problems that I wanted to address in Disclosure. So I brought a lot of those together. And what really sparked my interest and really got me to get back in the Bible again was when I learned about Genesis 6, how the sons of God procreated with human women. And I'm sure your listeners are probably all too familiar with that. And that's what really started it for me. And I realized, I had never heard this in church. I must have read Genesis 6, 100 times, but it never really clicked that this is angels and humans mating here and creating this hybrid offspring, the Nephilim. So I wanted to take those sorts of fringe topics and put it in a way that somebody that was coming into it from a traditional background would be able to understand and accept. So that was Disclosure, and I had that out. And then after that, I started writing little miniature, I called them mini study books. They were like 50 pages just on different topics. I had 5 of those, and one was on the 4 different kinds of baptism in the Bible. There was one about the Day of the Lord, what that really is. There was one on spiritual warfare and what the spiritual government is like. And then there were a couple others. One about the resurrection and ascensions of Christ, and then there was one other one about what loving God really means. So I had those 5, and that's where the name Mini Study Ministry came from, was from writing those books. So I put all those together. I still have them for sale, individually. They're like $5, and then I have them all in an anthology that has some extra stuff that I've written throughout the years. So I wrote all that, and then after that was when I wrote Quantum Creation, and then my most the book that I just put out a few months ago is Cherubim, Chariots, and that was the one where I wanted to take concepts of physics to show how reports of UFOs and things like that. There's 2 main hypotheses on what those are to people that believe that it's something outside of the Earth. People either usually subscribe to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which says that they're from another planet, and then there's the extra dimensional hypothesis, which actually goes right in with spirituality and scripture and things. So I wanted to write a book trying to use physics, and especially quantum physics, to show how the extra dimensional hypothesis, even though it's not as well known, it actually does make a lot more sense, and it's a lot easier to understand. I think a lot of the confusion really just comes from what dimensions actually are. So that's what Cherubim Chariots was all about. And then now I'm working on a book. This will be my first. Every book that I've written so far has been self-published. This one that I'm working on now will be the first one that'll be traditionally published. It'll be published through Defender. I'm sure people are probably familiar with Tom Horn, but if not, you can go to skywatchtv.com and learn all you want. He's an excellent researcher and writer and lots of stuff, but he'll be publishing that. And this one's looking at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, and really what the discovery of the Higgs boson meant for the world, not only in terms of scientific progress, but really in terms of prophecy. And if if biblical prophecy talks about any discoveries in quantum physics. If there's a lot of theories that say the Large Hadron Collider is going to open a doorway, to the abyss, and so this book explores a lot of those things, but it also really gets down to the science of what they're doing, so people can, because it's really not that difficult. It's just, unfortunately, the people who are put in charge of explaining these things to the media, they've been they're usually physicists and scientists, so they speak their own language, and it doesn't always translate to people like us. So I want to put together a book that really talks about the science behind it, but also what it has to do with the Bible and prophecy. So that's what I'm working on now. Those are pretty much all my books.
Well, that's quite a bit of work. You've been very, very busy. I commend you on all of your endeavors, and those are all very intriguing topics. And likewise, myself,